Welcome and thank you for joining Sopra Steria Insights. Whether you're passionate about technology, leading a business, or simply curious about the digital landscape, this podcast is for you. We continue our AI series today, and the next topic we're delving into is hyperautomation. It's easy to see why this topic gets industry excited. We're talking about organizations going far and beyond just automating repetitive tasks, but full-scale transformation of business processes end to end. With me today, I have Richard Caddick, Consulting Director at Sopra Steria Next, and Simon Baxter, Principal Analyst in TechMarketView. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be here.
Richard, let's start with you. What exactly is hyperautomation, and how does it differ from traditional automation?
Yeah, cool. So I'll take the traditional automation part of that first of all. So if we imagine tools such as RPA, robotic process automation, what that is really good at doing is mimicking the same task lots and lots of times. So you can set it a path through an interface or through a piece of software, and it will be able to repeat the steps that it's been taught pretty much in a kind of like-for-like fashion every single time. Hyperautomation totally expands on that. And the idea of hyperautomation is that it's the orchestration of a number of different new technologies. So RPA is one of those, but also there's machine learning, maybe some predictive analytics, maybe some AI, some use of some LLMs in order to entirely transform business processes. And so rather than the RPA just being able to execute one task, a user may be able to say to hyper-automated bit of technology, how do I achieve this? And it can reach into the large language model and give some guidance. It can start processing the kind of data and listing the response in a different way to join up all those technologies together into an end-to-end improved process.
So really joining the dots and automating the automation effectively, and some by the sound of it, Richard.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think the key word that I keep on coming back to is the orchestration. So it's literally, there's a purposeful reason for doing the hyperautomation, and the orchestration keeps everything in beat, literally, to make sure that the outcomes and objectives desired are reached.
So thank you, Richard. In terms of the real world examples of the application of hyperautomation, Simon, is that something you're seeing as an analyst across the market?
Yeah, absolutely. Hyperautomation is, it's a very broad field, right? As kind of Richard mentioned, there's a lot of different tools and technologies that are within that. I think from my perspective, AI is kind of eating the automation topic a bit right now. It's really dominating the kind of broader business conversation about how you elicit change in your business among certain processes of business domains. So I think the two topics are kind of converging. Obviously, natural language machine learning sits as part of that hyperautomation stack. But I think at the minute AI is kind of dominating the conversation. I think what's quite interesting is, so TechMarketView ran a survey over the summer and autumn of kind of UK business leaders. And part of that, we asked them what were some of the top technologies that were driving change for their business. I think what was interesting that came out of that was, almost 80% of them said AI, Gen AI. Data analytics kind of followed that at kind of like 60% of people, and automation was down there at 46%. And that's kind of interesting, kind of shows you the kind of the at least AI is still top of mind. Automation is still highly up there, but the two are, again, very, very closely related. I think what was also interesting from that survey was that we also asked them, well, where did they actually plan to invest their money? Because obviously organizations are already quite far on their journey of automation, perhaps more than AI. And this was really reflecting that data that the next 12 months, businesses were saying that around 71% of them said they're going to invest in AI and Gen AI. Interestingly, 44% was then sales and marketing. And then it was business and digital transformation at 43%. And automation was down there at 38%. So what does that kind of tell us? It tells us, again, AI in terms of where people want to put their money right now is really top of mind. Automation is still up there, but there's kind of this interesting divergence between what businesses kind of see as a drive for their business and where they're kind of putting their money.
And thank you, Simon. And Richard, you're at the front edge of this with Sopra Steria Next, working with our customers. Are you seeing that on the ground, as Simon describes? You know, there's a focus on AI at the moment, it's consuming a lot of airspace.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where you get into a really interesting conversation, actually. So the AI investment I totally see, and that's being enabled more and more through the use of SaaS products, whatever those are, and AI is being incorporated into those now as well. Literally, you can't go into a bit of SaaS software without a sprinkling of AI throughout it. The interesting thing comes to me thinking about those stats. You know, why is automation lower? Some of it will happen with the implementation of those AI tools. So those AI tools will bring automation capabilities. What then needs to happen as you're looking across the suite of tools and technologies that you have within an organization, excuse me, is that you need to think about, well, where next do we automate? And so there's much more of a kind of consulting like process there to work out where the opportunities spaces are. The other thing is that to do automation and hyperautomation well, you need to adopt a new mindset. So you really need to adopt this continuous improvement and much more agile mindset, which is much more of a change for an organization. So actually implementing AI tools and having access to those tools is a relatively straightforward thing. Actually shifting your whole organization so its culture is moved towards the continuous improvement is a much bigger program of change. So I can kind of see how that stacks up, and what Simon's shared kind of stacks up in a fairly sensible roadmap, which is, yeah, do your AI investment first, and that will lead through into the kind of continuous improvement and automation type technologies afterwards.
And just to add to that, Ambeth, I mean, I don't want to paint the picture that automation and hyperautomation is not a really big growth area, because it absolutely is. The key is that the AI and automation are really entwined in this hyperautomation conversation. And actually, we did a research report a few months back where actually we were looking at the market for hyperautomation in the UK is set to grow by 80% over the next 4 years, surpassing over 5 billion in market size. So it is a huge area of investment. But what's interesting is, there's a lot of convergence between these topics, as I mentioned. And even when we look at some of the big plays in like the RPA space, like UiPath, again, they're starting to shift conversations towards things like agentic AI, which again is automation is underpinning that, as well as supported by the natural language and machine learning and LLMs that are driving that change. I think the challenge for businesses is, where do they start with a lot of this? How do they move along their hyperautomation, their AI journey, their data journey, their cloud journey, all these different layers that they've got to work out how these different areas integrate and support each other to kind of grow their business and drive change.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you make there, Simon, actually around data. And as we heard in another podcast in this series, we heard from Susanna Machka from Sopra Steria Next, where she described data as being the oil or the fuel empowering AI, right? And for you, Richard, I mean, obviously data is critical for successful AI. How important is data and analytics for hyperautomation, do you think?
It's right at the center. Yeah, exactly as Susanna said. Without the data and without a good understanding of the data and access to the data, and in the hyperautomation world, that might mean access to multiple different systems. Only by doing that well can you start doing hyperautomation. So I'd say there were two fundamental kind of building blocks at a baseline of hyperautomation. One is access to the data. The other is actually an understanding and access to the processes. And so there's a really good suite of technologies, kind of process mining technologies, which are looking at actually what are what are the processes that people are doing, not what we think they should be doing, but what's actually the processes that are flowing through the system, and how can we learn from those around the improvements that we might make in order to make more streamlined, more transformed services. So I think those two are key. And then the third one is obviously just the humans involved and actually understanding. And as you know, my background is in human-centered design and user experience, and that's where I come from when I'm thinking about any technology. And it's about actually what are the needs of the users, and how can we give them the information or the answers to whatever it is they're exploring more easily. But secondly to that, well, what's the work that they're doing which they probably shouldn't be doing? You know, what's the churn work, the admin that actually could be better and maybe more accurately done if it were automated, so that people can spend more time thinking about the high value or necessary work that's available to them. I'm working on a lot of programs at the moment where it's about HR. And so let's say an individual's got a payroll dispute in a hyper-automated role. They might be able to go into a chatbot, they may be able to log their dispute, they may be even able to resolve it, which means that they don't need a phone call with an HR manager. So HR managers can actually dedicate more of the time to people who really need help, maybe in a vulnerable situation or in a well-being situation, that can't really be automated. So kind of using humans where humans need to be used where it's valuable, and use automation where it's needed to be valuable as well.
Okay, so it sounds, from listening to you both, it sounds a completely compelling proposition. Right? We're expecting to see 80% growth in this area of hyper-automation alone. We're expecting to see it empowering the human and really augmenting humans with greater speed, greater accuracy, and greater access. So I mean that all feels pretty compelling. So if I'm a CTO or a head of DDAT out there thinking, I really need to get into this, but I'm looking at my estate and thinking, actually, do you know what? I've quite a lot of technical debt here in legacy. Do I need to scrap that and kind of move to a completely new infrastructure, or are there things that I can be doing, Richard, that allow me to hyper-automate on an existing estate of applications?
Yeah, totally. I think with the process mining and data mining type tools, that will work in legacy estate as well as in next gen SaaS technologies. I think I'd probably take a step back from that though, and think about actually what are the outcomes, and how are we best as an organization going to achieve those outcomes. So I would always start with some sort of discovery type program, whatever that looks like, where you can really just seek to understand, where are we as a business, where do we want to get to, and what's the path that we're going to take as an organization, and making sure that all stakeholders are on board with it. When you reach into kind of hyper automation and any automation, CTO and the technology view is part of it, but it will also impact HR. It will impact kind of every part of the organization, and so really you need to get the whole of the C-suite behind it and understanding what it is you're trying to do, because it will affect the business as a whole.
And that is very interesting, because that is my next question actually for you, Simon, which is around the impact on the workforce of hyper automation, and looking at the view that you have across industries and seeing what's happening at the front line of this hyper automation wave that we're seeing. What skills are most in demand, do you think, in terms of right now, but also in the future, and how can people position themselves and upskill for those kind of roles?
Yeah, so it's interesting when we look at kind of how AI and automation is kind of being used, right? Because as I said, it's really about that augmentation at the moment. It's about tools that will make people's jobs easier. And when you're using, whether you're using some automation RPA, or whether you're using more agentic type AI, there shouldn't be huge amounts of training to use those tools. They're meant to be very natural, that flow into the day-to-day. I think that the skills bit is a very, very difficult area to answer around what does it really mean for like the future of work. I think it's a very big topic, probably more than this podcast. You could do a whole deep dive on the future of work. But the kind of positive is that automation and AI are going to reduce those mundane process type driven tasks. They're going to free up people to do more potentially creative bits, more customer focused roles, as Richard said. There's more difficult areas that are complex. The tricky bit is saying, well, what will be the kind of the skills that will be required in the future? And you could say, well, it's those more softer, those more creative skills that are harder to automate. But then AI is actually really good at some of those creative aspects as well. It's proven to be almost one of the areas that people didn't expect with AI. Everyone was initially focused on, it's actually going to be really bad at creative aspects. But actually, it's proving you want to use it for marketing, you want to use it for design, you want to use it to even come up with proposals and ideas. It's great at doing that, assuming it has the right data and an experience to build off of. So what does that mean for people? Well, it means that it's going to be working with those tools to an extent, and it's going to be understanding, well, what new roles might be created because of that. And that's the bit we don't really know yet. We don't know what these jobs of the future might be and exactly how people will be able to move between them. Because someone, for example, who's been doing Excel data processing for the past 15 years of their career, are we really asking them to now become a data analytics role? Maybe some could, but to expect that whole industry to overnight to reskill to be able to capable of that, it doesn't seem to quite kind of fit with my view of how we're seeing things progressing. So this is going to be an area that's going to continue to evolve. And for businesses, it means they're going to have to look really closely at what roles and areas of their business are being disrupted, how people can be developed in their careers, how they can retain the knowledge and the industry knowledge and the business knowledge they've kept. We don't want to lose those people, but they're going to have to find a way to balance this reducing cost through automation AI, because that's a big core part of it, and what they do with those people that they don't need now, that are being replaced by automation and agentic and those other types of technologies.
That is really, really interesting, because obviously when people talk AI and hyperautomation, the first thing that springs to mind is technology. And as we heard from Richard, then we talk about process mining, so we're touching on the process. But what you're saying there is all about the people, and to Richard's point around user-centered approach and beginning with that user in mind. It feels like, Richard, a cultural shift in terms of how organizations respond to this. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's super interesting. It reminds me of the birth of the internet and people having all these sorts of existential crisis about what the internet would mean for the future of work. And that was 25, 30 years ago. And it's the same conversation that we're having now around AI and automation. What's it good for? How's it going to change what we do? How are we going to use it? How's it going to make us money? How's it going to change our organization? And literally, back then they didn't know. And you had organizations really scratching their heads and arguing about what the future of the internet might mean. And the same thing was true when mobile phones, smartphones in particular, came along and apps started being pushed out to them and the internet was available in your device, and it changed how we interacted and can interact with technology. And so the birth of AI and automation, while they're not new things, they're at a particular scale now where they're making real inroads into how we work. And so, yeah, the same questions are kind of coming back around again. And I think it's a really good opportunity actually to step back, and for organizations to step back, think about the journey they want to go on, the outcomes they want to achieve, and how AI and automation can help them. And within that, it's really important that we do it well. And so we need to think about the integrity of the data, the security of the information that as organisations we look after, so people's data is protected. And I think there's a need to think about the ethics of using AI and automation within organisations, just to make sure that it's done really well. And I know you're going to talk to one of my colleagues, Nick, and there'll be an episode with his just laser-like focus into the ethics, and that will be a really interesting conversation to for you to have and for us to be able to listen to.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And I think, Simon, just thinking, if I could get you to dust off your analyst's crystal ball and begin to look ahead for the next 5 to 10 years, which feels like a really racy kind of window to be looking at in this fast-moving AI world. Where do you see things heading for hyperautomation?
Yes, it's a really interesting topic, and I guess there's this misconception, I guess, that when we talk in these broad brush terms about AI automation, that everyone is at the same part of their journey, and that isn't true. I think when you look at really digital native organizations, they've kind of got this luxury of being able to kind of apply automation and AI from the ground up and build these like almost end-to-end processes. But when we look at more traditional organizations, they've got this legacy estate, right? They've got to apply automation quite piecemeal or in kind of really complex transformation programs. So, some organizations we've spoken to recently, we spoke to a logistics company, they're just launching RPA right now. Same with some police forces. They're still at that part of their journey. They're just doing the RPA part, let alone talking about advanced AI and LLM. So what's the future? Well, it's going to depend on who you are, on what industry you're in, and how quickly you move to adopt these types of technologies. I think the interesting kind of conversation that we're going to need to have is kind of the people cost versus the AI and automation cost. So I think the more expensive and complex it becomes to employ people, so the wages, the taxes, the hiring, we've seen a lot of folks around now around rising employee cost. Well, the more those go up, the more valuable automation and AI becomes. So it's this constant battle between people and tech, risk and reward. And those organizations who've been running very people-based services for kind of decades now, look at some of the VPS providers, they know that model. They know people are a known quantity to them. Applying end-to-end or even piecemeal automation, it could be quite risky, for them. So not everyone is going to jump straight from, paper-based processes to full agentic AI. There's a wide spectrum here. So the future is going to be, an evolution of AI, of course. It's going to increasingly deliver more value to businesses. It's going to evolve that hyper-automation layer. There's going to be increasingly more tools that have to fit as part of that orchestration layer that Richard talked about. And organizations are going to have to try and keep pace with the pace of innovation that we see in the market, while trying to simultaneously, if they're those more traditional businesses, continue to evolve that legacy stack. And eventually, they might have to start overhauling parts of it. And that could be a really big cost and a big change to both kind of the people, the technology, and those entire business models. But that's what it's not just about the technology, it's about the whole evolution of certain industries and businesses that is going to define the future of hyperautomation and AI.
I think that's so interesting, Simon, because it effectively mirrors Richard's point around the beginning of the internet. It feels like that's where we are today. We're at the foothills of this. And who would have predicted where we would be with mobile apps, mobile integration, all the stuff we were wanting when we first got our mobile device. Wouldn't it be great if you could do this? Who knows where hyperautomation is going to take us, particularly with those kind of cultural shifts that we talked about. So one final question from me for you, Richard, in particular. Right? You've talked about how organizations approach hyperautomation and some of the things that they do. What are the first steps I should take if I am a CTO or a head of DDAT today thinking I want to look at hyperautomation? Where should I begin?
Yeah, perfect. So I would recommend literally as simply as having a small workshop with a few people and just thinking about actually what is it that we're looking to achieve as an organization, and how might we get there. So super small, we run the type of thing where it's we call it a hot house or a little workshop session, where we can just bring a few people together and just lead them through some very simple questions that will help them work out where they might start as an organization. And I think, as Simon so brilliantly put, everyone is at a different place, and so for us, it's about understanding, okay, where is that place, and how might we help them move forwards.
And focus on the outcomes, as you rightly say. Where do we 100%. Want to go with this? Yeah, and even it is before taking that small step. So thank you, Richard. And believe it or not, Simon, Richard, we've come to the end of the podcast. So I'd just like to thank you both for your contribution to this. It's been a super engaging and interesting conversation. And for those of you listening, if you would like to hear more in this series, please hit subscribe, and we can make sure that you get the next parts of this series. So finally, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Richard.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for inviting me here. It's been a great session.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. Good to talk to you, Simon.